Imagine the year is 1209. The air in southern France hangs thick with the smell of burning pitch and wet earth. Bells toll in the distance, not for worship, but for death. You can almost hear the echo of horses, the rumble of armor, the whisper of fear through the narrow cobblestone streets of Béziers. There, beneath banners marked with the cross, men claim to march for God. But if you could look into their eyes, you might see something colder. A zeal so fierce it's indistinguishable from madness. They came here to cleanse the land of a people who called themselves the pure. The world would remember them by another name, the Cathars. The Cathars were Christians, at least in the way they understood Christianity. A faith stripped bare of gold, of hierarchy, of indulgences. They believed the world was corrupted, that the church had become drunk on its own power. They refused to worship the cross, not out of defiance, but because they saw it as a symbol of suffering, not salvation. They were quiet, disciplined, spiritual, and that terrified the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. The church branded them heretics. Not sinners to be forgiven, but infections to be purged. And when Rome decides an idea is dangerous, it doesn't debate, it destroys. So Pope Innocent III called for a crusade, not against Muslims, not against pagans, but against fellow Christians. A holy war against their own. The armies gathered like thunderclouds. From the north they came. Peasants and knights, mercenaries and fanatics, lured by promises of salvation and plunder. They carried swords blessed by priests, convinced that every stroke would bring them closer to heaven. When they reached Béziers, they found a city refusing to surrender its people. The Crusaders demanded the Cathars be handed over. The townsfolk refused, and so the army attacked. The slaughter was so vast, so blind, that even the Crusaders hesitated. They asked their commander, the abbot of Cîteaux, how to tell heretic from believer. And the abbot's reply, whispered across centuries like a curse, was simple: kill them all. God will know his own. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an erasure. Men, women, and children fled to the cathedral, hoping the house of God would protect them. The doors were locked. The torches were thrown. The flames roared like a living thing, consuming stone, wood, flesh, and faith together. By the time the smoke cleared, Béziers was gone, 20,000 souls erased in the name of purity. That day, the church didn't just kill people. It killed the idea that faith could belong to the individual. It was a warning written in fire. There is only one way to believe. But the Cathars did not vanish overnight. In the hills of Montségur, a final remnant held out for years. A fortress in the clouds, where men and women prayed under starlight, surrounded by enemies. When the Crusaders finally reached them, they offered mercy if the Cathars would renounce their faith. Not one did. They were marched down the mountain, hands bound, singing hymns as they walked into the pyre. 200 burned alive. Witnesses say they didn't scream. They prayed. And for the first time, their killers hesitated, as if unsure whether they'd destroyed evil or holiness. Centuries later, the wind still whispers over those ruins. Some say on cold nights, you can hear faint voices, not of ghosts, but of conviction, of people who dared to believe differently and paid for it in ash. This wasn't just a massacre. It was the moment Europe learned that the sword could define faith, the beginning of something dark that would echo again and again. The idea that belief, in the wrong hands, can justify anything. But this was only the beginning, because once the church learned how easy it was to burn its own, it would never forget the smell of smoke. Next came another people, just as faithful, just as doomed, those who dared to read the word of God for themselves. The snow falls softly over the Alps, blanketing the valleys between France and Italy. The mountains are silent now, but once they echoed with the sound of hymns. Soft, human voices carried through stone villages, praying not to defy, but to understand. They called themselves the Poor of Lyon. The world would remember them as the Waldensians. Their story doesn't begin with rebellion. It begins with a man, a wealthy merchant named Peter Waldo. One night, as the story goes, he heard a minstrel sing about the brevity of life. Man, the song said, was but a shadow. Here today, gone tomorrow. It shook him. He gave away his fortune, dressed in rags, and walked the streets preaching simplicity and poverty. the way Christ's apostles once did. He wasn't against the church. He only wanted to live the gospel as it was written. Literally. But in medieval Europe, faith wasn't something you lived freely. It was something controlled, interpreted, approved. Waldo did something unthinkable. He translated the Bible into the language of the people. The language of farmers, of shepherds, of those who couldn't understand Latin. For the first time, ordinary men and women could read the words of God themselves, and that terrified the hierarchy. Because knowledge is power. And the church wasn't about to share it. The Waldensians spread fast, from Lyon to the valleys of Piedmont, from village to village. They didn't build cathedrals. They didn't wear robes. They gathered in fields, under stars, speaking the gospel in the tongues of the common folk. Women preached beside men. There were no golden altars, no indulgences, no hierarchy, only faith. To the church, that simplicity was dangerous. If the people could find God without priests, what use was Rome? And so, the Waldensians became heretics. At first, they were warned, then excommunicated, and finally, hunted. Papal legates declared them enemies of Christ. Crusaders were promised the same forgiveness for killing them as they'd receive for fighting in Jerusalem. Armies descended into the narrow mountain passes, and the valleys that once rang with hymns began to echo with screams. The Waldensians fled into the high peaks, barefoot, starving, clutching their children as snow swallowed their footprints. Soldiers followed, dragging torches, swords, and fear into places untouched by war. Entire families froze to death rather than surrender. In one account, survivors tell of a massacre in the valley of Lucerna. The troops sealed men, women, and children inside a cave, the same cave where they once worshipped in secret, and set fires at both ends. The smoke rose slowly, thick and merciless. When the soldiers finally entered, they found hundreds lying still, hands clasped in prayer, eyes open toward the ceiling that had been their sky. The few who escaped scattered across Europe, hunted, hiding, always carrying their faith in whispers. They became ghosts in their own land. Parents told their children never to speak of what they believed, never to trust strangers, because in those times a wrong word could mean the difference between life and the pyre. But even through the darkness, the Waldensians refused to vanish. For centuries, they hid their Bibles beneath floorboards, passed their prayers in secret, and taught their children that faith was not something granted by the powerful. It was something born inside the soul. When the Protestant Reformation swept through Europe hundreds of years later, the Waldensians emerged from the shadows, their language and faith still intact. But the cost had been unthinkable. Entire generations erased, valleys soaked in blood, families who never saw another sunrise. You can still find their villages today, quiet, isolated, surrounded by mountains that once betrayed them. If you walk there at night, the wind feels heavy, as though it remembers. Because the story of the Waldensians is not about victory. It's about endurance. It's about what happens when faith becomes defiance, when the simplest prayer becomes a revolutionary act. And if you think Europe learned its lesson after this, you'd be wrong. Because soon, the holy fire would move north, to the frozen lands of the Baltic, where a new crusade would rise, a war not against Muslims, not even against heretics, but against entire peoples who refused to kneel before Rome's new empire. The wind coming off the Baltic Sea bites like a blade, cold, sharp, and endless. 1,000 years ago, these lands were covered in pine and silence, no cathedrals, no crucifixes, only the rhythm of drums, the crackle of sacred fires, and the old gods watching from the trees. This was the edge of the known world, the frontier of Christian Europe. And in the eyes of Rome, frontiers were not to be respected, they were to be conquered. They called them pagans, the Livonians, the Prussians, the Lithuanians. But these weren't savage tribes, they had kings' laws and faiths older than the empire that sought to erase them. Their gods were carved in oak, their rituals tied to the land, birth, harvest, death, all woven into nature's breath. But to the church, that kind of belief was intolerable. The cross must rule every horizon, and no corner of earth could belong to another god. And so began a crusade not in the sands of the Holy Land, but in the frozen forests of the north. The year was 1206. The Pope sent his blessing to a new kind of warrior, The Sword Brothers, knights forged in ice instead of desert heat. They came wearing white cloaks marked with black crosses, banners fluttering in the snow, convinced they were the hand of God made flesh. They built castles out of the bones of villages they destroyed. They baptized entire towns at sword point, convert or die, whispered through smoke and screams. One chronicler wrote that they dragged pagan priests from their temples, forced them to kiss the cross, then burned them alive for hesitating. Whole tribes were slaughtered, their children taken and raised in monasteries to forget the gods of their fathers. But even in terror, the old faiths fought back. The Prussians rose in rebellion, striking from forests like ghosts, vanishing before the knights could react. They ambushed processions, desecrated churches, and retook their sacred groves. For a moment, the pagan world seemed to breathe again. But Rome had patience and endless steel. The Sword Brothers were joined by the Teutonic Knights, a machine of faith and discipline that would turn conversion into empire. They called their wars the Northern Crusades. And they didn't stop until every pagan altar had been shattered, every forest spirit silenced. By the end, even those who surrendered were doomed. Villages baptized one day would be taxed and enslaved the next. Lands were carved up, cultures rewritten, languages buried beneath Latin prayers. What made it darker was that this wasn't just conquest, it was purification. The same fire that had consumed the Cathars now burned through the Baltic, carrying with it the certainty that God had chosen sides. To the Crusaders, they were saving souls. To the conquered, they were watching the world die. Imagine standing in a forest at night, hearing the sound of axes cutting down the sacred tree your people had prayed to for generations. Imagine watching monks hammer a cross into the stump while your family is chained beside you. Imagine your gods, the ones you thought eternal, vanishing beneath the shadow of foreign banners. That's what genocide looked like before the word existed. Not quick, not efficient, but slow, deliberate erasing not just people but identity. And when the fires finally died, the church had gained new kingdoms. The Livonian and Teutonic orders built cities, cathedrals, and trade empires atop graves. The Baltic lands were Christianized, but the soul of the place, its heartbeat, its memory, was gone. Even now, if you walk through those forests, the silence feels heavy. The trees stand like witnesses. And if you listen long enough, the wind seems to carry echoes of languages no one speaks anymore, prayers to gods no one remembers. Europe had cleansed another piece of itself, and each time it did, it grew darker, more certain that the sword and the cross were one and the same. But the story doesn't end there, because soon the fire would turn inward again, not against pagans, not against heretics in the mountains, but against scholars, priests, and dreamers within the church itself. Men who dared to ask questions that no one was supposed to ask, and one of them would light a spark that even Rome couldn't fully extinguish. The bells of Prague toll softly in the dawn, their echoes rolling across mist-covered streets. The year is 1315, and Europe stands on the edge of another storm, a quieter storm this time. One born not of swords, but of words. In the heart of Bohemia, a man named Jan Hus takes the pulpit. His voice is calm, his tone almost gentle, but his words carry fire. He speaks of corruption, of greed, of how the church, the same church that claims to guard the soul of Christendom, has become a merchant of salvation, selling forgiveness like a market good. He dares to say what millions think but fear to whisper, that no pope, no priest, no king stands between man and God. That faith belongs to the heart, not the hierarchy. At first, his words stir admiration. The common people adore him, a priest who speaks their language, who preaches honesty over power. But the church hears something else. They hear danger. They hear rebellion. They hear a man who could undo centuries of control with nothing more than truth. And in medieval Europe, truth is treason. Hus is summoned to answer for his heresy. Promised safe conduct, he travels to the Council of Constance, a gathering meant to reform the church, but in truth, designed to break dissent. He arrives believing justice still has meaning. He never leaves. The moment he steps inside the council chambers, guards seize him. Chains bite into his wrists. He is thrown into a dungeon, the air thick with mold and betrayal. For months he's interrogated, demanded to renounce his words, to kneel and confess that he was wrong. But he doesn't kneel. He doesn't beg. He tells them, "I would rather die than betray the truth I have found." And so, on a summer morning in 1415, Jan Hus is led to a stake. The crowd gathers. His robes are torn away, his head crowned with paper thorns painted with devils. As the executioner lights the fire, Hus prays softly. Flames crawl up his body, turning white robes to smoke, faith to agony. His last words, whispered through the crackling, are said to be, "You may roast this goose, but 100 years from now, a swan will rise that you will not silence." That prophecy would echo through time. A century later, Martin Luther would stand before another council and speak the same defiance. The swan had risen. But for the people of Bohemia, Hus's death wasn't the end. It was ignition. When news of his execution reached Prague, it was like fire poured onto dry tinder. His followers, called the Hussites, rose up in fury. Peasants, soldiers, priests. They gathered under banners marked with the chalice, symbolizing communion for all, not just the chosen few. Rome answered the only way it knew how, with another crusade. 5 of them, in fact. Armies from across Europe descended upon Bohemia to crush the Hussites. But this time, something was different. The faithful no longer knelt. They fought, led by blind generals who saw clearer than most men ever could. The Hussites turned wagon trains into fortresses, peasants into warriors. They shattered crusade after crusade, driving back forces 10 times their size. For the first time, the Church's armies broke. The machine of faith that had consumed Europe for centuries, that had burned the Cathars, hunted the Waldensians, erased the pagans of the north, faltered. Because belief had finally fought back, the Hussite wars ended in blood, compromise, and exhaustion. But something irreversible had happened. The idea had survived, that God could be sought without permission, that faith could live without chains, that no empire, no pope, no king, no army could own the human soul. But the cost was staggering. Towns reduced to ash, generations lost to fire and famine. Europe bled itself in the name of salvation. Again. When you look back now, through the smoke and the centuries, you begin to see the pattern. Every time someone dared to believe differently, Europe answered with fire. And each time, something inside humanity dimmed, a little more freedom, a little more wonder, a little more of what makes faith human. These were not just wars of religion. They were wars for control of the mind. The Cathars, the Waldensians, the pagans of the Baltic, the Hussites, all crushed beneath the same idea that unity mattered more than truth. But even the darkest ages leave sparks behind. And those sparks would one day ignite revolutions, reformations, and the long, painful birth of freedom. So when you walk through Europe's cathedrals, remember, beneath every marble floor lies another story, one not carved in gold, but written in ash. If you've felt the weight of this forgotten history, if you've sensed the ghosts in these words, then keep that curiosity alive. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we're still capable of repeating. So stay curious. Stay questioning. And if you want more of the stories that history tried to bury, the truths the victors tried to erase, then like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more hidden chapters of the human story. Because the past doesn't whisper, it warns.